It was the summer of 1944, somewhere in the shattered villages south of Caen, France. A German sergeant from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend sat across a table from a British intelligence officer at a prisoner collection point behind Allied lines. The sergeant had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front. He fought at Kharkov. He had held positions against Soviet human wave attacks that had annihilated entire German companies around him. He was not a man who frightened easily. The British officer asked him a routine question about the fighting quality of the various Allied forces he had encountered. The sergeant answered about the Americans without much emotion, acknowledging their firepower but dismissing their infantry as prone to caution. He said similar things about the British, noting their methodical tactics and their reluctance to exploit success. Then the interpreter asked him about the Canadians. The sergeant's answer was different. He did not reach for clinical military language. He paused. Then he described something his men had started calling fighting without a switch, a phrase used by veterans of his division to describe opponents who did not seem to recognize the moment when a rational soldier would stop pressing an attack. There was no switch, the sergeant said, no point at which they stopped coming. The interpreter wrote down the observation, filed it, and moved on. But the same language appeared again and again in the debriefs conducted by Allied intelligence officers across Normandy, across the Scheldt, across the Rhineland, and into Germany itself. German soldiers who had fought on the most brutal front in human history, who had measured themselves against British professionalism and American firepower, consistently described the Canadians with a particular kind of language, not the language of tactical analysis. The language of men describing something they did not entirely understand. To understand why German soldiers developed this specific fear of Canadian infantry, you have to begin in the years before the war, because what the Canadians brought to Normandy in 1944 was not an accident. It was the product of a set of decisions made between 1939 and 1944 that were unlike the decisions made by any other Allied nation, decisions that produced an infantry culture that German soldiers encountered on the battlefield and found profoundly unsettling in ways they struggled to articulate. Canada declared war on Nazi Germany on September 10, 1939, 1 week after Britain. The delay was deliberate and constitutional. Unlike Australia and New Zealand, whose declarations had been automatic upon Britain's, Canada's Parliament voted independently. It was a small distinction with enormous implications. Canada was choosing this war, not because an empire had been attacked, not because its homeland had been bombed. Canada looked at what was happening in Europe and decided, through its elected representatives, that it was worth crossing an ocean to fight. The men who volunteered in the first months of the war carried that choice with them. They were not conscripts. They were not reluctant draftees. They were men who had looked at the situation and decided to go. This voluntary quality never entirely left the Canadian Army, even as the war continued and conscription became necessary for home defense service. The men who actually served in Northwest Europe were overwhelmingly volunteers at the infantry level, men who had made a specific and considered decision to be there. But voluntarism alone does not explain what German soldiers encountered. Thousands of volunteer armies in history have broken under pressure. What made the Canadian infantry different began with what happened to them after they volunteered. The 1st Canadian Army built its training doctrine on a philosophy that British military historian John English later described as the most thorough preparation for battle of any Commonwealth force in the Second World War. The man most responsible for this was Lieutenant General Andrew McNaughton, who commanded Canadian forces in Britain from 1939 to 1943, and later his successor General Harry Crerar, who commanded the 1st Canadian Army through Northwest Europe. But the doctrine itself came from a harder source. It came from the memory of 1917. Canadian officers who designed the training programs of 1940, 1941, and 1942 had either fought at Vimy Ridge themselves or had been trained by men who had. Vimy Ridge in April 1917 was the defining moment of Canadian military history, the battle where all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps attacked together for the first time and captured a position that the French and British had failed to take for years at enormous cost. The Canadians succeeded at Vimy not because they had better soldiers in the abstract sense, but because of a training and planning methodology that was unlike anything else in the Allied order of battle. Every soldier at Vimy knew not just his own objective, but the objectives of the men beside him and the men behind him. Every man had studied the terrain on a plaster model of the ridge. Every man knew what to do if his officer fell, if his sergeant fell, if his corporal fell. The attack was designed to survive the death of its leaders at every level, because the men at Vimy had learned from 2 years of failed British and French attacks that leaders died, and that an attack which stopped when its officers died was an attack that had already failed. The officers who designed Canadian training in Britain between 1939 and 1944 treated Vimy not as ancient history but as a living lesson. They built a training system that created exactly the kind of soldier the Canadian Corps had created in 1917. A soldier who understood the objective, who could navigate to it without his officer, who could improvise when plans collapsed, and who did not interpret the death of those around him as permission to stop. The training was extraordinarily thorough. Canadian infantry units in Britain underwent 5 years of preparation before the D-Day landings, a period so long that it became a source of frustration among the soldiers themselves and of jokes throughout the army. The men who landed at Juno Beach on June 6, 1944 had been training since 1939. They had done every exercise that could be conceived. They had practiced every scenario. They had been trained and retrained and trained again. By the time they boarded their landing craft, there was very little that could happen to them on a battlefield that they had not already prepared for in some form. But there was another element to Canadian preparation that had nothing to do with tactics or training schedules. It had to do with what the Canadians had been through before they ever set foot on a French beach, and what it had done to them. On August 19, 1942, approximately 5,000 Canadian soldiers landed on the beaches at Dieppe, France, as part of Operation Jubilee, a large-scale raid intended to test German coastal defenses and the feasibility of seizing a port. Of the Canadians who actually landed, 9 and 16 were killed. More than 15,800 were taken prisoner. Only 2,210 returned to England. The Dieppe raid was one of the most catastrophic military operations in Canadian history. The Germans had been alerted. The defenses were far stronger than intelligence had suggested. The seawall could not be climbed by the tanks that were supposed to support the infantry. Men were killed in the landing craft before they reached the shore. On Blue Beach, where the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish landed, machine gun fire from the headlands above cut through the attacking troops before they could reach cover. In the end, the objectives were not taken, the lessons were bought in blood, and the survivors carried back to England something that no training exercise can simulate. They carried back the experience of what a German defense actually felt like. Every officer and NCO who returned from Dieppe had felt the specific texture of German machine gun fire, German mortar patterns, German defensive discipline under pressure. They had seen exactly how German soldiers fought when they were surprised, when they were pressed, when they thought they had won. And they had seen where the German system had gaps that a more prepared, better supported attack might exploit. The Dieppe survivors became instructors, planners, and in many cases the backbone of the first wave units that landed on Juno Beach nearly 2 years later. Their knowledge was not theoretical. It was physical. It lived in the specific way a veteran holds his rifle differently than a man who has never been shot at, in the particular instinct that sends a man to the correct piece of cover before he consciously knows why. General Bernard Montgomery, who commanded Allied ground forces in the initial Normandy campaign and who had spent the previous 2 years evaluating every Commonwealth force in his theater, wrote in his personal assessment in May 1944 that the Canadians were the best trained assault troops he had available. This was a remarkable statement. Montgomery commanded British, Commonwealth, and subsequently American forces. He had the 50th Northumbrian Division, one of Britain's most experienced formations. He had the 3rd British Infantry Division. He chose Canadians for Juno Beach, the center of the British-Canadian sector, specifically because of their preparation and because of what Dieppe had taught them about what actually happened when men tried to cross a beach under fire. On June 6, 1944, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed on Juno Beach and advanced farther inland than any Allied force on D-Day. The British on Golden Sword beaches, fighting with roughly comparable conditions, had not advanced as far. The Americans at Omaha had not come close. Only the Canadians at Juno reached their D-Day objectives and in several places exceeded them, pushing beyond Courseulles-sur-Mer and toward Carpiquet airfield, objectives that would not be fully secured for weeks but which no other Allied division had come close to touching on that first day. The German 716th Infantry Division, which defended Juno Beach, had the same concrete bunkers, the same overlapping fields of fire, the same artillery support as the defenders on the other Normandy beaches. The difference was in the attackers. Canadian infantry had been told in their briefings that there would be an attempt to get off the beach and keep moving regardless of what was happening around them. The cultural instruction ran something like this: the beach is the worst place in the world. The beach is where people die. The only way to stop dying on the beach is to stop being on the beach. So you move, they moved, and the Germans noticed. What German soldiers encountered in the fighting south of Juno Beach in the weeks after D-Day began generating the specific kind of reporting that worked its way up through intelligence channels on the German side. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the formation tasked with containing and eventually destroying the Allied lodgment around Cannes, was composed of some of the most fanatical and well-trained soldiers in the German order of battle. The division had been formed in 1943 from members of the Hitler Youth and was commanded by Waffen-SS officers who were by any military measure among the most effective combat leaders Germany produced. They were not easily impressed and they were not easily frightened. Their commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, later described the fighting against Canadian infantry in terms that his own subordinates would have recognized. He wrote that the Canadian troops were extraordinarily aggressive at the small unit level, and that their subordinate leaders, meaning their NCOs and junior officers, demonstrated initiative that the division had not encountered in the same form fighting the British. This was not a minor observation. The German command philosophy, the famous Auftragstaktik or mission tactics, was built on precisely this quality: the ability of a corporal or a sergeant to identify an opportunity and exploit it without waiting for orders. The Germans considered themselves the masters of this form of fighting. When they encountered it in Canadian infantry, they found it deeply disorienting because the doctrinal advantage they believed they possessed, the advantage of a fighting culture built around individual initiative, was being matched or exceeded by the men attacking them. The fighting around the Abbaye d'Ardenne and Carpiquet airfield in June and July of 1944 became some of the most brutal of the Normandy campaign. The Hitlerjugend division defended these positions with extraordinary ferocity, conducting repeated counterattacks against Canadian gains, and in several instances perpetrating war crimes against Canadian prisoners that were later prosecuted at Nuremberg. The intensity of the German response was itself a measure of something. You do not counterattack with your best troops repeatedly, at great cost, against an adversary you do not take seriously. The 12th SS counterattacked against the Canadians at Carpiquet on July 4, 1944, with tanks and infantry, pushing back the initial gains of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the North Shore Regiment. The Canadians returned the following day and pressed the attack again, and the day after that, the airfield changed hands in pieces over days of fighting that German officers later described as among the most exhausting defensive combat of the entire Normandy campaign. Not because the Canadians had overwhelming superiority, they did not, but because they did not stop. To understand why this quality was so specific to the Canadians and so different from what German soldiers experienced fighting British or American infantry requires understanding the institutional cultures of all three forces and the specific way those cultures manifested in the infantry soldier's relationship to his objective. British infantry doctrine in 1944 was built around what military historians call the set-piece battle. Montgomery had refined this approach over years of Mediterranean campaigning, and it rested on a simple principle. You do not attack until you have overwhelming force. You prepare, you coordinate. You bring in the artillery, the tanks, the air support. You wait until conditions are favorable, and then you attack with everything you have. When conditions are not favorable, you consolidate and prepare for the next operation. This doctrine minimized British casualties in the long run. It also meant that there were pauses. German defenders, fighting Montgomery's forces, learned that when an attack stalled, there would be a period of reorganization before the next push. They could use that time. They could reinforce threatened positions, evacuate wounded, adjust their line, Bring forward reserves. The British gave them time because British doctrine built in time. British infantry under Montgomery did not press attacks that were not going well. They pulled back, reported, and waited for conditions to improve or for different orders. This was not cowardice. It was doctrine. But German soldiers on the receiving end of it understood its rhythms and could work within them. American infantry doctrine, particularly in 1944, emphasized firepower over maneuver at the small unit level. American infantry came to rely on calling in artillery and air support before advancing, suppressing German positions with overwhelming fire, and then moving forward through the wreckage. This made American operations extremely dependent on the radio and the forward observer. When the communications worked and the fires came in properly, American infantry was devastatingly effective. But it also meant that American attacks could be stalled if the fire support was not available or not responsive. German soldiers learned that an American advance that was stopped would typically result in a call for artillery rather than a renewed infantry push. They learned to disperse and take cover when artillery came in and to reoccupy their positions and engage again when it lifted. The cycle of suppression and advance was predictable in its shape, if not in its timing. You could build a defensive scheme around it. Canadian infantry doctrine in 1944 drew on elements of both British and American approaches, but was structured around a different fundamental assumption. It assumed that the attack would continue, regardless of what was happening. The fire support was important, and Canadian artillery coordination was excellent, but it was not a prerequisite for the infantry moving. A Canadian section that had lost its radio, whose fire support was not responding, whose officer had been killed, was still expected to find a way to its objective. The training had prepared it for exactly this situation. Every man knew what to do when everything went wrong. Every man had been trained to see the objective, not the obstacles between himself and the objective. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, which jumped into Normandy as part of the 6th Airborne Division, demonstrated this quality in its purest form in the opening hours of June 6, 1944. The stick drops were scattered by high winds and anti-aircraft fire. Many men landed miles from their designated drop zones. Equipment was lost. Units were mixed together with men from different companies, different platoons, sometimes from different regiments. By any rational assessment, the operation should have been massively degraded by this disruption. Instead, the Canadians formed up whoever they could find, identified the nearest objective that matched something in their training, and attacked it. They did not wait for reorganization. They did not wait for orders from above. They had been trained to understand the purpose of the operation at every level, and in the absence of their own officers and their own units, they improvised toward that purpose using men from other units, British paratroopers, soldiers whose names they did not know. By morning, objectives that should have required coherent unit operations had been seized by improvised groups of men who had never trained together, but who shared a fighting culture built around the same fundamental assumption. You move to the objective, you do not stop. This quality appeared consistently enough in German intelligence reports from the autumn and winter of 1944 that it attracted specific attention in the assessments written by German Corps and Army staff officers in Northwest Europe. The fighting in the Scheldt estuary conducted between October and November of 1944 brought this contrast into its sharpest relief and produced some of the most explicit German commentary on Canadian fighting qualities. The Scheldt campaign was one of the most demanding operations of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. The estuary of the Scheldt River, which led to the great port of Antwerp, had to be cleared of German forces to open the port to Allied shipping. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance into Germany was starved of supplies. The Germans understood this and had constructed defenses on the Beveland Isthmus and the island of Walcheren that were among the strongest they held in the entire theater. The terrain was a nightmare. Polderland, below sea level, reclaimed from the sea by dikes, offered almost no cover and almost no room for maneuver. Infantry could not go cross-country because there was no cross-country. Everything moved on the tops of dikes, narrow elevated causeways that could be covered by machine gun fire for their entire length. Attacking across a dike causeway toward a prepared German position was as close to World War I frontal assault conditions as anything seen in Northwest Europe in 1944. And the Canadians were the ones who did it. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division attacked across the South Beveland Isthmus in October 1944. The causeway to Walcheren was covered at every point by German fire. Engineers had calculated that a man walking upright on the causeway had a life expectancy of approximately 30 seconds. The first Canadian crossings were repulsed with heavy casualties. The Canadians came back. They came back in darkness, in rain, in cold that soldiers described as a physical force, through standing water and under fire that German mortars maintained throughout the night. The 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade's assault on Walcheren demonstrated the specific quality that German soldiers had been describing since Normandy. The attack was losing men at rates that would have caused other forces to consolidate and request reinforcement. The Canadians used the dead ground beside the causeway, waded through chest-deep flooded fields, bypassed the strongest German positions, and got onto the island. The German garrison on Walcheren, composed largely of the 70th Infantry Division, a formation notorious in the German army as the Magen Division or Stomach Division because it was staffed primarily by men with severe gastrointestinal disorders who had been assigned to relatively comfortable coastal duty, found themselves fighting an infantry force that was pressing attacks after dark, in conditions that standard German doctrine considered prohibitive for offensive operations. The 70th Division fought hard, but they had not been prepared, temperamentally or physically, for what was coming at them. The German Army Staff Assessment, written by the staff of the 15th Army, which faced the Canadians during the Scheldt campaign, made specific note of the Canadian tendency to continue offensive operations under conditions that German doctrine classified as unsuitable for attack. The assessment noted that Canadian small unit leaders demonstrated a degree of tactical autonomy that required German defending forces to maintain active vigilance even when weather and terrain conditions would normally permit relaxed defensive postures. In plain language, the Germans could not take a break when it was raining because the Canadians attacked in the rain. They could not relax at night because the Canadians attacked at night. They could not assume that a repulsed assault meant the fight was over for the day because the Canadians came back. There was a specific cultural reason for this beyond training and doctrine, and it goes to the heart of why the German reaction to Canadian infantry was distinct from their reaction to the British and Americans. The Canadians were fighting for different stakes than their allies at the institutional level. Britain was fighting to survive and to preserve its empire. The United States was fighting a global war with global interests, conscious that it was building the architecture of a post-war order in which its power would be paramount. Canada was fighting because it had decided to fight. It was a middle power with no empire at stake and no global hegemonic ambition, composed of immigrants and the children of immigrants from the nations it was fighting beside, and in some cases, the nations it was fighting against. Canadian-born men of German descent served in the Canadian Army. Men named Schmidt and Weber and Hoffmann wore the maple leaf and stormed German positions in Normandy. The army that attacked Germany was in part composed of men whose grandparents had come from the country they were now fighting, and none of that contradicted the fundamental commitment that had brought them across the ocean. This created a fighting culture that was, in the assessment of those who studied it, unusually free from the particular kind of institutional paralysis that affects armies fighting for abstract strategic objectives. Canadian infantry knew why they were fighting in a way that was personal and chosen rather than strategic and assigned. They had not been ordered to care. They had decided to care. And the difference between a man who has been told to take a position and a man who has decided to take a position is the difference between a soldier who stops when he runs out of energy and a soldier who stops when the objective is in his hands. The battle for the Hochwald Gap in February and March of 1945 brought this quality to its final and perhaps most brutal demonstration. The Rhineland Campaign, Operation Veritable, was the Allied push through the dense forest west of the Rhine River. The terrain was more favorable to the defender than almost anything the Canadians had faced. Even in Normandy, the forest canopy caught artillery shells and detonated them above the ground, spreading shrapnel through the trees in horizontal showers that killed men in foxholes who thought they had cover. The mud was so deep that vehicles sank to their axles and had to be abandoned. The German 1st Parachute Army, elite troops who had fought at Monte Cassino and throughout Italy, had been brought north to defend this ground. They were not the coastal garrison troops the Canadians had pushed off Walcheren. They were among the best soldiers Germany had left. The 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions fought through the Hochwald in conditions that veterans later described as worse than anything they had experienced, including Normandy. Men fought from tree to tree in forests so dense that visibility was measured in meters. Artillery could not be observed effectively. Air support was impossible. German paratroopers used the trees as observation posts and snipers, and their fire was continuous and accurate. The fighting degenerated to what military historians call close combat, which is a clinical phrase for a kind of killing that takes place at ranges measured in arm's length, in which bayonets and entrenching tools are used, and in which training and doctrine become largely irrelevant, and what matters is the willingness to close with another human being and refuse to disengage. The Canadians closed with the German paratroopers in the Hochwald, and they did not disengage. The 1st Parachute Army's records from February and March of 1945, examined by historians after the war, show that the Army's operations officers specifically flagged the Canadian sector as requiring heavier defensive reinforcement than the British sector to its north, despite comparable pressures, because Canadian attacks had demonstrated a consistency of pressure that German defenders in the British sector were not experiencing to the same degree. The German paratroopers defending against the Canadians were being hit harder and more continuously than paratroopers in comparable positions. The German command's answer was to send more men to the Canadian sector. Those men were taken from somewhere else. The story of why Germans feared Canadian infantry specifically, and not American or British infantry in the same way, does not have a single answer. It has several interlocking ones, and they all connect back to the same fundamental point. The Canadians had built an army that was institutionally designed to continue attacking after the point at which most other armies would stop. They had built that army through 5 years of preparation informed by the memory of Vimy and chastened by the catastrophe of Dieppe. They had staffed it with volunteers who had chosen to be there. They had trained those volunteers to understand the objective so completely that the death of their leaders did not stop the attack, only changed who was leading it. And they had sent that army into the most demanding infantry combat in the Western theater. The German soldiers who described fighting without a switch were reaching for language to describe what happens when you face an opponent whose training has specifically prepared them for the moment when everything goes wrong, and who has been taught that the correct response to everything going wrong is to keep moving. Most of the time in war, things going wrong means the attack stops. German defensive doctrine was built on this assumption. Create enough chaos and casualties, and the attack loses momentum, and once it loses momentum, the defender can counterattack and restore the line. The Canadians did not follow that script, and German soldiers who tried to apply their defensive playbook against them found it did not work the way it was supposed to. The chaos did not stop the attack. The casualties did not stop the attack. The counterattack sometimes stopped the attack temporarily, but the attack came back, and then it came back again, and eventually the German paratrooper in his foxhole in the Hochwald, who had been fighting for 3 days without sleep, who had seen his company reduced to half strength, who was out of rations and low on ammunition, heard the sound of Canadian infantry moving through the trees again, and understood with a clarity that required no analysis that this was not going to end the way he needed it to end. General Lieutenant Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army in the Rhineland, was captured by Canadian forces in March 1945. He was subsequently interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, who asked him, among other things, to assess the various Allied forces he had faced. His comments on the Canadians were direct. He described them as his most difficult opponents in the entire Western campaign, specifically citing their willingness to press attacks in terrain and conditions that German doctrine classified as unsuitable for offensive operations. He described their small unit leadership as the most consistently aggressive he had encountered. He compared their tactical persistence unfavorably from his perspective to the more methodical British approach, which at least allowed his men occasional periods of relatively stable defense. Against the Canadians, he said, there was no stable defense. There was only preparation for the next attack. In the prisoner cages and interrogation rooms of the final months of the war, German soldiers described the three Western allies in terms that had hardened into near universal consistency. The Americans were feared for what they could summon, for the artillery that came down like a visitation, for the air power that made daylight movement a death sentence, for the logistics that replaced every loss with two more. The British were respected as professionals, predictable in the best military sense, precise and thorough, and ultimately unstoppable given enough time and resources. But the Canadians were described with a different quality in the German language that does not translate cleanly into English, something in the vicinity of what German veterans called einen Gegner, der nicht aufhört, an enemy who does not stop. Not invulnerable, not invincible, just not stopping. The German soldiers who said this were not offering a compliment in the conventional military sense. They were reporting an operational reality that had cost them positions, counterattacks, reserves, and ultimately battles. But in the strange way that war creates its own forms of respect, the men who described this enemy were also paying a tribute that no citation or medal could match. They were saying that they had done everything the doctrine told them would stop an attack, and it had not worked. They were saying that they had encountered something that their training had not prepared them for. Not a stronger weapon or a smarter tactics, but a different quality of will that they had felt in specific physical terms, in the pressure that did not ease after dark, in the attacks that resumed at dawn, in the infantry that appeared out of the flooded fields of the Scheldt in the middle of the night, and did not stop because it was raining. Canada lost 45,000 soldiers in the Second World War, out of a population of fewer than 12 million people. Proportionally, it was a higher toll than the United States, which entered the war later and fielded a force 10 times the size. The men who died in the Hochwald and on the Scheldt and on the beaches of Junio are buried in cemeteries across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands under stones marked with a maple leaf, among the most decorated formation for its size in the Western Allied order of battle. The Germans who feared them had not expected to find them dangerous. They had expected amateurs from a country that had not fought a major war in a generation. What they found was something that the history of Canadian military culture, from Vimy to Dieppe to the specific decisions made in training facilities in Britain between 1939 and 1944, had been building toward for 25 years. They found an infantry that had been taught that the objective was the only thing that mattered, that the obstacles between a man and his objective were problems to be solved rather than reasons to stop, and that the correct response to the death of the man beside you was to take one more step forward. This was not the American way of war, and it was not the British way of war. It was specifically and distinctively Canadian, and the German soldiers who survived it never forgot what it felt like.